Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here. I've got my baby girl right here with me, so hopefully sound quality is good, but taking a slightly different tone than I normally do, just to help make sure she doesn't wake back up. But today we're going to be continuing in our series, taking a look at uh, the campaign that we've been designing, the Liberation of Kairos. And so you'll see here the Zern Central website. When you click on StarCraft TMG, it's going to be one of the first ones right here, the Liberation of Kairos. And so in our last two videos, we took a look at just the overview of what you get with the campaign. In the last video, we took a look at the first two missions, which are kind of the original arc, right? You know, the original thing that Argos Company was tasked with doing on the planet of Kairos. But then as we reach into mission three, whatever the third one is that you're going to complete, the stakes rise. And as is quite common actually for private contractors, what ends up happening is we get a choice mission. Because High Command has been approached by local governors and, provincial leaders and things like that to not just rescue the members of Thales Foundation, but to help to reclaim the entire planet. Because, of course, you don't have a whole lot of power as a regional governor or a provincial leader if you don't really have a planet, right? And so because of that, High Command, having heard from them what it is that they desire, decides, yeah, we can definitely go in and our team can totally do this for the right price. They strike a bargain, everything is made up, and the result is that unfortunately, you have to tell your team, hey, you know how we just rescued all of these wonderful people and got them off the planet? Well, we're going to be here for a little bit longer, and this results in a choice mission, which your adjutant tells you a little bit about. Your first choice, which we'll cover first, is that you're being hailed by a Protoss vessel. The vessel has been stranded on the planet's surface, and so they're holding on the communicator for you to be able to talk to. And then the second is that in order to help the cause, since you're apparently going to be here for a little while, you've detected a functioning factory on the planet's surface that's near Talos Station, one of the smaller outposts located on the planet of Kairos. And so you have a choice. You can either try to reclaim the factory before it's destroyed by the Zerg, or you can help out the Protoss. And so we're going to go through that choice between these two presently, and that'll be what this video is about. So to start off with, you get hailed by the other ship, and this, the person who leads them is a Protoss by the name of Aurora. He is the chief scientist and geologist on board the Eye of Norkun. Okay, and he was dispatched down in a shuttle called a Warp Prism if you're doing StarCraft 2. It could be a shuttle if you're doing the era of StarCraft 1. Kind of taking a look at it, he has a couple of zealots that are with him just to keep him safe as they were going to come down here and do some geological studies. But then they were shot down by Zerg air defenses that they had not preempted. And so the result is that only a handful of his men have survived, and they can't escape from the planet on their own, so they need pickup. And so, of course, your team, because they are reasonable people, ask the honest questions, right? Which is, hey, we have limited resources. We're involved in a planet-wide campaign. Like, what's in it for us? Why are we doing this? And Aurora understands this, right? Protecting your own people and preserving your firepower is a helpful thing. And so he does not take offense at this question. Okay. He does mention that they have a bunch of things that they've discovered, but they're glad to share some of their technology with you as a response. So this is a very unique style of upgrade that you can get. You can actually get a Protoss upgrade for some of your units if you successfully win the mission. Okay. And therein lies the critical thing. And so your team begins to kind of talk about it a little bit, trying to figure out what it is that they can do. Corporal Cora Dalton, the medic hero that we provide in the campaign, specifically mentions that she would be more than glad to help out, and that maybe they could be of use. I will tell you in passing that is also a swift nod from us on the design team to tell you why you don't technically need to take Corporal Cora Dalton. She is a very useful asset on this mission. So just things to think about. But suffice it to say, they agree to go on in. And so you end up with the setup. You'll be using the crash site map. We provide the ID available, and it's relatively simple. You're going to be deploying so that way, the Zerg will be deploying on the sides. The Terran will be deploying on the southern board edge. And the crash site is located 6 inches in from the northern board edge, okay? And so the Protoss will be located within, I think it's, let's see, what is that? I think they deploy, yeah, within like 3 inches of the crash site. Okay. The result is that your forces are actually potentially conducive for three players if you want to do three players. Otherwise, the Protoss can be just controlled by the Terran player if you don't have a third player. But those units are locked. Those ones you always know. You're going to start with the power field upgrade because we want you to be able to block some hits as needed. And then you're going to have Aurora, of course, the chief scientist of the High Templar Norkun, and two squads of three zealots with the My Life for Ire upgrades. They have better impact hits, and the We Stand as One, so they do better when they're fighting in the same close combat as another unit. The exact count of models here is very important. So while you can um, technically, obviously, you can proxy. So let's say that you don't own zealots, you instead own, say, I don't know, adepts, for example. You can do 500 points worth of adepts if you want to. Well, 400 points of adepts plus Aurora, right? The Just know that that does potentially change your secondary objectives. So more on that a little bit later, but just suffice it to say, that's like the one thing that you would need to consider. It's not necessarily imbalanced, but it could be imbalanced. At the very least, us on the design team for this campaign, we have not tested it with proxies. Okay, so I'm recommending two squads, three zealots each, plus Aurora, so seven models total. And if you just bought the starter set, you can use one of your adepts to represent Aurora if you want to, because it's on the same size base. Or you could use Artanis, I suppose, if you really wanted to. I think generally I'd prefer to use the Adept just because it kind of tells me, okay, this isn't like a power hero person who's supposed to be running into combat because Aurora is not that character. Okay. And then the Terrans, they're getting 1,000 minerals worth of material, starting supply of 5 and 100 points of Vespene gas. You can kit it out as you want to. Of course, we take Corporal Carol Dalton in this one, escorting her with a bunch of Marines and Marauders. You can technically use any unit, so you could take Goliaths in this one. I decided not to, just because I kind of felt like since you're only getting one supply of return, if you don't start loaded out with a bunch of the Goliaths, you're probably not going to be fielding very many of them. And then the Zerg also get 1,000 minerals, and you might say, well, that isn't very fair. Why is it that you get basically 1,500 minerals versus 1,000 minerals and 140 Vespene gas effectively because there's no 10 gas upgrade yet for the Protoss versus 100 Vespene gas? Isn't that not fair? Well, when we get to the objectives, you'll soon see, and we discovered this in testing. It actually kind of had to be this way because there's a little glitch in how scoring works so that technically the Zerg actually start with a dramatic advantage in this mission. More on that a little bit later. But just suffice it to say, they decided to take the Hydralisk leader alongside a very large group of Hydralisks that makes up the bulk of their army. But then they also grabbed some Banelings because if you have to fight Zealots, Banelings are a really good choice. And then a larger squad of Zerglings held in reserve for later. Now, as we look at Aurora's profile, a couple of things that you'll notice. First of all, I suspect that this will be roughly-ish some of the things that we might end up seeing from potentially some High Templar-esque sort of characters. He is built a little bit differently because he's supposed to be a scientist, okay? He's not just your average High Templar. But a couple of things just to note up front. First of all, of course, he is a commander. We aren't really doing anything with objectives, so it doesn't really matter, but it might matter for disengaging in case he wants to get away from stuff. That's where it really is going to come in. He does have improved shields, so he starts with 3 shields instead of the normal 2 that I anticipate a relatively low level, low points character would probably have for the Protoss. And he does start with the renewal ability. This is the one that, of course, it's basically a heal. And so it's very unique. You might tell yourself, Protoss with a heal, don't know if I like that. Just suffice it to say, it is absolutely essential for this mission. We did try one where we never used it. Do keep in mind the entire army only has 1 psi energy for the entirety of the round, and it means you're not using the power field. So there's actually a very interesting question as to whether or not you use renewal or not. There's also an interesting question on maybe you would decide to use 2 gateways instead of using a power field because it gives you 2 cards, even if it's not maybe quite as useful as power field for keeping your guys alive. It might allow you to do renewal more often with Aurora, which might be more useful. So there are some choices there. There are some thoughts there. Again, the examples are not designed to be a meta-built way of doing it. We found that it was nice just to have another option for being able to block hits because hits might actually be more useful than wounds, especially if you're up against something like, say, Hydralisks or Banelings, for example. But just suffice it to say, from an abilities perspective, he's clearly a support-tooled character. His damage output is not particularly great. He does have the ability at the start of the move phase, if he or another unit are, within 6 inches, are not engaged in close combat, they do have the ability to regain 1 shield point, which is something we haven't seen yet, but is necessary for this mission, as you'll soon see. He has the psionic grasp ability, so he actually has the ability to apply a debuff, which means that, if somebody's running a queen, for example, they can actually remove debuffs, which is great. You actually don't tend to get too many of those coming out from the Protoss, at least at present. So there's that. And then they do also have the awareness through the Kala ability, where if Aurora does not move during this phase, then he can perform evade saves against ranged attacks, which can be really nice, except that, of course, if you've got a lot of melee units swarming around, he is very fragile. Uh, and of course, there's no real way for him to perform evade saves against close combat. So if he does get surrounded and he gets hit in close combat, that could be really, really, really bad. In terms of attacks, he has the Psionic Blast, which is basically two attacks, not a particularly great chance to hit. He does surge at least, so there's that, and it can hit ground or air, because of course you could potentially have things like Mutalisk flying around in this eventually, right? Because this campaign is not restricted to opening units only for the release of the game. So I guess that is nice, and he would be the only thing that can shoot at flying units from the Protoss. So that's something we're thinking about. And then in close combat, it's basically the exact same sort of thing. Again, not particularly great. So you can tell he's not really a combat-oriented person. He's more for support of your 6 zealots. You also do get, well, I guess technically you do get 2 psi energy every turn because you also get your faction card. And so, yeah, you do end up getting Norkun's crew. It's relatively simple. Basically, yeah, for the scientist one, if you want to tap it for the ability, then the active unit can perform an evade save against ranged attacks, which could be useful. You might actually find you're better off spending that psi energy instead of using the ability, but that is something you can at least have access to every single turn, which is nice. And Norkun's crew will appear in future campaigns from us as well, as the Eye of Norkun is one of the main ships for one of the other campaigns. And then you also have Psi Blast. So once per game, a unit within 12 inches of the active unit cannot use active abilities this round. This is designed to reflect basically that you used your psionic energy to siphon away their energy, similar to what High Templar can do in the game. And we kind of represent that by just saying, well, that unit cannot use any of your special resource to tap their abilities. And so that's kind of how we designed it and built it, which I think is kind of an interesting way of doing it and being able to apply that to the game. So now to explain why everything's built out the way we do, the primary and secondary objectives are relatively straightforward. So the Terran's goal is to reach the crash site and defend Aurora against the Brood. Okay, so if Aurora is slain, then you lose. Okay, and if Aurora is slain, then the Zerg win. Nice and simple. Okay. This also means that since victory points are not accrued during this mission at all, you will always roll 2d6 for initiative. The Protoss units are always considered to activate third in initiative order, unless you have 3 players playing, in which case all players roll 2d6. Okay. So it will either be Terrans get to activate a unit, Zerg get to activate a unit, Protoss get to activate a unit, so on and so forth, or it'll be Zerg get to activate a unit, Terrans get to activate a unit, Protoss get to activate a unit, right? But even, and the critical thing being the Protoss cannot pass. That is an important thing to be here because the Protoss are not technically a player, right? Now, if they are being controlled by a third player, then yeah, they can pass as normal. But if it's just 2 players, and it's you and your buddy meeting up, Protoss do not have the ability to pass, which means they, because they're basically part of you, right? Or at the very least, they cannot pass early, right? Once they're completely done with all of their units, then technically they would pass because they can't do anything else. But they're not, it's not a situation where you can just say, okay, well, first thing is off the bat, I'm going to pass. They are basically always considered to activate third. Okay. So just things to think about. That is also designed for balance. So that way you can't just run away with the Protoss, rejoin up with the Terrans, and then hide behind a gun line, right? You can't do that. The Zerg are almost guaranteed to always get there. For the secondary objectives, there's a couple of things that are in play, which is kind of cool. The first is that the Terran player gains 1 campaign point for each Protoss zealot that survives the battle to a maximum of 6. And the Zerg have the antithesis, where they gain 1 campaign point for each Protoss zealot that is slain during the battle. They're getting vengeance on some of their ancient enemies. And so because of that, this is one of the reasons why I think Power Field is better than a bunch of the other options. As much as you may love things like gateways, you're going to want to be able to preserve some of those models. Okay, and I think Power Field's going to be one way to try to do that. It also means that, I'm going to be honest, it's almost impossible. We at least didn't find a way when we tested this to save all of the zealots. If for no other reason than at some point somebody's gonna, use a Hydralisk, roll dice, and you're gonna flub an armor save at some point, especially on a 5+, right? Even if you're getting an evade save against stuff by tapping your special card, you're going to lose people. And so when you're potentially losing zealots, you're going to probably at least lose a few. And we found that it was almost always, um, you were always losing at least two or three, is what it seemed like to us. So at the very least, from a secondary objectives perspective, it means that you can't just focus down Aurora. You do have to actually go after the zealots as well if you want to gain some of those campaign points to advance the rest of your brood. Or you have to get in there quickly and save them, which means you can't just sit back in gun line with the Terran because, and this is the reason why we didn't feel bad keeping the points the same and why it actually didn't change very much. We never had an overkill scenario for the Terrans, is because the Zerg don't have to fight the Terrans at all. Right. They could spend the entire time just fighting against the Protoss, which they outnumber from a minerals perspective 2 to 1, and from a models perspective, easily 3 to 1. Unless you're just going like straight Hydras, maybe straight Roaches, then it might be closer to 1-on-1. And even then, like you'd have pretty beastly Roaches if you were trying to keep it to roughly 7 models for your entire army, right? Like, I mean, there'd be a lot of investment there. And so the result is that we discovered it was a difficult time for the Terran slash Rotos the entire time because if nothing else, they didn't want to cough up a ton of campaign points, right? And they still have to keep Aurora safe. And it's not like the Zerg are just coming in from one side. They're coming in from all sides. You could try to move into the middle. That's not actually going to save you all that much. It's just going to bring you a little closer to the Terrans. There are some ways around it. If you are looking for tips and hints, maybe we'll do a follow-up video as part of this series, kind of talking through some of the, kind of pro tips that we discovered as we were working through it, some of the tactical card upgrades and things like that you might want to prioritize. If you find that you're struggling or if you find that it's just dramatically imbalanced, some things that you may consider thinking about. But let us know down in the comments below if that'd be helpful. And then the big thing, of course, is, in terms of things that happen during the game, it's literally just supplies increasing by 1 every turn. And at the end of round 5, all you're checking for is Aurora still alive? As long as he has 1 wound left, the Terrans win. Okay. If Aurora is dead, Zerg win. Nice and simple. And then come the rewards. So what happens is that if the Terrans win, you gain the gratitude of the Protoss, and you may add an experimental shield tech unit upgrade to one of your units. And so just taking a quick look at what that is. Oh, actually, before we do that, because we're going to be jumping down there for the Zerg as well. If the Zerg win, then they recover a Mordian arthropod from the Protoss ship, which is one of the little critter things that's present in StarCraft 2. I think it might have actually made an appearance in StarCraft 1 now as I think about it. But the thing is that this little guy has a really nice armored carapace, and so you gain an experimental carapace unit upgrade to one of these things. So effectively, for winning the campaign, for winning this particular mission, you end up gaining effectively a 3 campaign point upgrade in addition to the campaign points that you gain for your troops, which is kind of awesome. And so taking a quick look down here at Appendix 2 to see what's going on there and what these things do for you. The experimental shield tech upgrade means that the unit increases its shield's value by 2. So you could have a unit of Marines that has 2 shields on it. Or you can have a Goliath that has 2 shields on it. Or you can have a Marauder unit with 2 shields on it. And you could keep a medic alive. You can technically add this to a hero character. So you can have a hero character with 2 shields on it. And I mean, that's kind of useful, right? There's no way to replenish those. Generally isn't in the game currently anyway, because we haven't gotten a shield battery yet. So, just in general, it's a couple of extra wounds, but it's a couple of extra wounds that you can suffer without losing any wounds, right? And that's useful, especially if you have a unit involving stim pack. And then the experimental carapace upgrade simply allows the unit to increase their armor value by 1 to a maximum of 3+. So, you can't really give this to a roach unit, but I mean, you double the number of saves you successfully make on average with a Zergling unit. You'd actually get a reasonably durable Hydralisk unit out of this, which is also really nice. And so, like there's a bunch of really useful stuff that you can do. You get a pretty beefy queen too, which is not a bad idea. And again, there's quite a few of the hero characters, both Kerrigan obviously, but also a number of ones we created for this as well that don't have a 3+ upgrade, armor save. So you could make your favorite, Zergling hero or Hydralisk hero or Queen hero or whatever, a little bit beefier if you really wanted to. And so kind of a fun mission. It's a little bit different. Again, it's another one of those rescue missions, but I think that that's kind of a fun way to do it. And I've found that that's kind of an enjoyable way to be able to play. And then for Talus Station, the opposite option is that you can go to try to recover this factory. And so your team kind of talks about it. You get the whole, okay, we got some good news, we got some bad news. Bad news is that High Command wants to stay here a little bit longer. And you get to kind of see a little more of the characters who are part of the crew, which I think is really great. And so, Sergeant Ty Fletcher, he's one of the Marines, very upfront. We mentioned this in his card when you're looking at the hero profile, just really upfront, but still, more than willing to jump in and do stuff. And he's just like, dude, like that is an easy, saying that we can actually accomplish this is very easy to say when you're on another planet in a nice high-rise building saying, "Oh yes, we have a crew that's local; they can totally handle it," right? We'd only have a couple hundred men. It's not like there's that many of us, right? This is a really big ask. But then they're able to talk about like, hey, don't worry, we have a plan for doing this. They're also sending us additional heavy support. They're reinforcing us. So like, help is on its way, but we can also take care of some of this on our own here locally. And so team starts coming together. They start having to talk about it like, hey, this would be a very useful thing for us to do. Found we had some issues with not having enough heavy support and, early, previously. So this could be really great. Let's jump in on it. And the team kind of comes together. They rally to try to do something very, very difficult. And as they end up coming through and getting the coordinates, you kind of see how the scenario works. So here we present Talos Station. Talos Station, we have the map ID, of course, for you to be able to throw in there, but use like a 50 millimeter token in the middle to represent the factory. You can technically use a real terrain piece. There are STL files that you can buy for factories. And of course, I guess you could always scratch build it if you really wanted to. Obviously, that will make it pretty massive. It'll be pretty large, which is fine. It's technically it's hard mode for trying to do this one, as you'll soon see. But it is also effectively the only objective on the map, which is also partially why we made it 50 millimeters, because it does matter a little bit more. And as you'll soon notice, having a greater amount of surface area does actually help to keep it pretty fair. You do also get two bunkers, and so we mark those in blue, so that way you can see where those go. Again, bunkers, we provide the profile down below, but it's extra wounds for the unit, and they can draw their range from any point on the bunker, which is kind of nice. It's preset to the Proving Grounds format. So in this case, you've got the Zerg on two sides, and you've got the Terran coming in from, in this case, the eastern board edge. And you've also got some scrap tokens. Scrap tokens are, of course, the one that we use. This is the secondary objective that we used in the first scenario. And so for every one that you come into base contact at the end of one of your movement phase, or I think even assault phase, but basically at the end of your moves, then you're able to kind of pick up these tokens. And they each give you one campaign point for the rest of the campaign, but that's all that they do. And in terms of your forces, you're now at still, again, 1,000 points. So this is the last one we'll be doing at the skirmish level, starting supply of 5, just like the last one. This time we decided to give you a sniper character, Lieutenant Natalie Cromwell, with the thinking that you might want to have to remove stuff. And we're keeping the Goliath in reserve because there are benefits to keeping your vehicles in reserve and not bringing them on as early as possible. You'll also see a unit of vultures here. More on that in about 20 seconds. But otherwise, relatively straightforward. They went for just straight Marines, no medics. And the reason why we went with that was, one, the points just worked out better, but also because if you're in bunkers, you don't really need the medics for the first little bit. This does allow you to kind of take advantage of it because, your Marines and Natalie can go in one bunker, your other 9 Marines can go in the other bunker since they can hold a supply of 2. And then ideally, your men from the bunker are protecting and engaging to preserve the factory. The Zerg are going for destruction, so they went with a cheap Zergling hero who helps out other units that are coming in close. And then we've got a ton of Zerglings. We've got a ton of Banelings, very important for trying to complete the objective. And then unit of Roaches, because it's nice just to have things that can shoot, which is always nice. And then we also have a unit of Swarm Hosts held in reserve. More on that in a little bit. But then when we look at the Vulture, Vulture's designed to be very fast. It is actually pretty lightly armored for being a vehicle, and with only 4 wounds each in a squad of 1 or 2, relatively easily removed, which feels correct to me in terms of how it applies in the game. Relatively low supply, though, which is kind of nice. You can run these relatively cheaply, which is always great. Not particularly expensive at 160 points to buy your 2 vultures. In this case, they bought a couple of the upgrades. So in this case, I think they got the Cerberus mine. So, they have a slightly higher range and rate of fire, which is always nice. So that way they can do a little bit more. They have Squadron, which makes sense because they've got those really big bases, so they need a little more range for unit coherency. But that also means that on a fast unit, they can move even faster and even further, which is cool. But the big thing, of course, that they have is they have the ability to lay spider mines, and you get a certain amount that you start with, but you can take that replenishable magazine to increase the number of spider mines that you have from 3 to 6. And the way these work is you're basically putting out 25 millimeter tokens, and when enemies move near the 25 millimeter token, then it attacks with the spider mine profile. And then they also do technically, of course, have the grenade launcher, relatively weak in terms of number of attacks, but it does do 2 damage each. So you don't have to sneak too many hits in order to do a decent bit of damage to lighter targets. Not that great against armored targets, but pretty reasonable against other stuff. And then for the swarm host, this one was tricky, right? Because the swarm host is not actually the thing that's attacking, right? It launches its locusts, which in the Heart of the Swarm campaign can be guys crawling around on the ground, or it could be flyers, potentially even little locusts that can shoot at things, right, with a ranged attack, instead of just having to get in close and chopping at things. And so we tried to do that by having really two profiles, right? There's a swarm host, and then it has the ability to launch locusts, and then that releases and allows you to place out another unit effectively, which is the locust swarm. And the locust swarm just activates as part of the swarm host activation. It's how it ends up working out. And so while the swarm host does have the ability to dig in, um, it can't actually burrow per se, but while it's dug in, it also has the ability to launch the locust, right? Which is the big thing for doing that, which is great. And so relatively simple unit, relatively durable, which is good. It doesn't have an evade save because I'm honestly not sure they even could, even if they wanted to. And you can take it as a single or you can take it as a double, depending on how much you want to double down on the locusts. And so the locusts themselves, not particularly durable. They do have 2 wounds each. So like they can take a little bit of punishment, but again, a 6+ armor save, even with that 4+ evade save, which they can get access to relatively easily, it's not it's not great. I want to be honest. This is not a particularly good resilience profile. That being said, the big benefit behind them is that each of them is getting 2 attacks. They're effectively a Zergling with acid saliva, so with a 6-inch range attack, which is kind of nice. Except that, of course, after 2 turns, they die, right? Whatever you have just disappears, right? And then you got to launch new ones in order to take care of them, which is cool, and also consistent with how things work. And then they do have pinchers in close combat, so even if you take them flyers, they can engage things in close combat. At which point they are now no longer flying, and they now count as ground targets, and thus can be targeted by everybody's melee attacks. Relatively straightforward, pretty simple stuff. Kind of a useful thing because if nothing else, they do have an anti-air attack. I'm sorry, not an anti-air attack. Oh, actually, hold on, time out. I feel like there's a, yeah, the projector glands. If upgraded by the swarm host, then they gain target all, so they can then target air units as well with their acid saliva, which is cool. But the scenario is relatively simple, right? You have a factory. The factory is located in the middle, and it can take, yeah, it's reasonably durable. It has an armor 4+ with 12 wounds. It also has, armored, the armored keyword, structure, ground, Terran, right? Relatively simple. And then at the start of round 3, you do have the opportunity, if you want to lift off. So now it changes its ground keyword to the air keyword. Now, here's the trick. You do lose some bonuses by the fact that Talos Station is now online and it is now lifted off, right? Because as we all know, lifted off Terran Terran structures cannot produce units. And that's one of the special things that ends up happening in this scenario. So to start off with, in as much as the factory is online and it has the ability to produce stuff at the starts of certain rounds, you gain the ability to use that factory as an entry point instead of having to bring your vehicles on from that far eastern board edge. And this is the reason why we left the Goliaths in reserve. So that's kind of fun and exciting. We love that. As long as you have at least 1 unit within 3 inches of the factory, right? So, and admittedly, since that's what you're defending, there's not a lot of reason to go beyond it, but that is one thing you do technically have to think about. Okay, so there's a lot of tactical stuff here. When do you lift off so that way Zerglings and Banelings and Roaches can't really do anything to you? Still might be in danger from Hydralisks, could be in danger from, in this case, things like if you want to use our Swarm Host profile, you can do that as well. Still in danger potentially from Queens. So, it's not like you can completely evade stuff, but depending on your enemy's army makeup, it could be a useful thing to lift off, right? Because if nothing else, some of those relatively cheap, relatively high number of attacks, Zerg units will not be able to target you because you don't have the right keyword, which is kind of nice. At the same time, you also can't produce from it, so you cannot get extra troops to kind of help you out, right? Which is great. And then, of course, we described the bunker, right? Armor 3 plus 8 wounds, has a bunch of the stuff. Although, actually, I realized here there's a slight mistake. It doesn't have the mechanical keyword, it should have the structure keyword, which I imagine banelings are going to cause a bit of a problem with. And then, of course, scrap material we've already talked about in the previous video, where basically you end your movement in base contact with one of scrap material tokens, you remove it from the board, and it'll count as one campaign point for you for the rest of the for the campaign. And so, as you'll see here at the end of round two, then the factory's boosters are online, so you're able to then use the liftoff special rule if you want to. And then at the end of round three, the first vehicle is ready, and so the factory has not lifted off. You can add one Goliath to the Terran force. That is a free unit that you can add. And similarly, at the end of round five, you can add one Goliath again to the Terran force if you want to. You can technically swap these out for vultures if you want to. We tried that once. We found it was a little oppressive to drop off a unit of 2 vultures and then they throw out a bunch of spider mines. And then basically by the time you clear through all of those and remove these multiple really large bases that were kind of body blocking for the bunker, I'm sorry, for the factory, then like another unit of vultures was added, and then they threw out a bunch of spider mines. So like it was a whole thing. But that's the way that that works. So I'm going to recommend Goliath. One, because thematically it works, where this is supposed to be an old factory, so I don't think it would make a lot of sense to have a lot of newer technology. So I think the Goliath is fine because it's kind of old tech, right? Going back to even I think the pre-Confederacy dates, if I'm not mistaken. So, toward that end, like I think that that's a really good thing. But then ultimately by the end of round 6, if the factory still has at least 1 wound on it, then the Terran player wins. And if the factory is destroyed, then the Zerg player wins, right? Nice and simple. This also means, of course, you aren't scoring victory points throughout the scenario. So you're always going to be rolling 2d6 to see who has the first initiative, which is interesting, right? Because you can't gimmick it, you can't game it in order to try to get access to the first initiative or to make sure that you don't and they have to move toward you. And then if you win, then if the Terran player wins, then they can add 1 factory card to their tactical card list for one of the next 2 missions for free. So it doesn't cost you any Vespene gas to add that card. Okay. If the Zerg player wins, then the factory is destroyed. And that means that if the Terran player ever starts a mission with a factory upgrade, then the upgrade starts activated during round 1. So you cannot use its abilities, which are really nice, and you cannot use its command point value, right? You don't have access to that CP. So you're kind of setting them back a little bit. At the same time, if they want to be able to run Goliaths or other stuff like that, the factory is one of the easiest ways to add those elite slots that you might need in order to successfully field the number of mech vehicles that you want, right? And if in the future we end up getting things that even cost like 3 elite slots, I could see the siege tank, most certainly the Thor, being at least in that category. Doing it without a factory could be really, really difficult, right? So you're basically guaranteeing that if the Zerg player wants to be able to say, all right, first round, we're starting you a little bit short, you can do that. And for the last 2 rounds, that could be a really big thing for the Zerg player. Again, people spend their stuff, and that's where we end it. And then we get ready to go into the end game. 2 more missions left to go, which we'll talk about in our next video. But just suffice it to say, I think that the choice missions are very interesting, right? Because they're both protection missions, preservation missions, where the Zerg are on all sides and you're trying to kind of work around them. But I think that this is also, just personally, I think a very rewarding way to be able to play, right? Because Terran, very often you want to kind of sit back, and you're kind of doing that with Talos Station. But I love the idea of they have to maneuver to a place where then they can kind of hunker down and fight against the enemy. If they have to be right down there in the middle of the battlefield, where it's very likely they're going to get in close combat very quickly, I really like the idea of using bunkers, because the bunkers do guarantee that they live a little bit longer, which is really nice. And so you can actually take advantage of shooting, and that way it doesn't get a little too lopsided. You don't feel bad if the enemy just goes with like just, whole squads of 18 Zerglings just going after you, which could be really hard for, smaller squads of Marines to handle. But what do you think? Interesting missions, interesting side missions, is it quite clear to you that there's one choice that you should basically always take? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.